a killer crawled through the dust to die alone. Instead, he found a life he had to save, and a new war he had to fight. What does a man become when the world around him turns to ash? He becomes a ghost, a silhouette of a past self, walking a land of graves. Sergeant Elias Thorne knew this truth in his bones, feeling it in the rhythmic grind of his broken shoulder and the phantom ache of a wound that had long since healed but never vanished. The land itself was a mirror, a vast, desolate canvas painted in shades of ochre and bruised purple, a reflection of the war that had stolen everything. He had been chasing a quiet death, a final surrender to the dust, when the impossible happened, a wisp of smoke against the brutal, unending horizon, a farmhouse, a whisper of life. The blood was a warm, sticky tide against his thigh, a constant reminder that his body was not his own, but a fragile vessel of pain. He dragged himself through the last stretch of the fading light, each motion a prayer for the end, each breath a curse against the cruelty of his survival. The sun was a bruised orange, bleeding across the plains, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to mock his slow, agonizing progress. He thought of the men he had watched die, their eyes wide with a question he could never answer. What was it all for? He carried their silence like a stone in his chest, a weight heavier than any pack. He had tried to outrun it, to lose himself in the vast nothingness of the West, but the past was a persistent shadow, always just a few steps behind. As he got closer, the scent of wood smoke, so pure and simple, hit him like a blow. It was the smell of home, of a life he had once known, of a kind before the world had been carved into pieces by the bayonets of men. The farmhouse was a small, defiant structure, made of dark, weathered logs with a single pane of glass glowing like a lonely star. A faint, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a thin, wailing cry carried on the wind. It was the sound of a child. It was a sound that had no place in this land of ghosts and sorrow. It was a sound that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He finally reached the small porch, his hand a trembling claw against the rough wood of the door. He didn't knock, he didn't have the strength. He just pushed, and the door, groaning on its hinges, swung inward. The world inside was a stark, almost painful contrast to the dying light of the prairie. The air was thick with the smell of old wool and a faint sweet smell he couldn't quite place. In the center of the room, on a simple hand-carved cradle, lay a baby. A single candle flickered on a table, casting a warm, dancing light on the infant's face, highlighting the red, tear-streaked skin and the furious clenching of tiny fists. The cry, he realized, was not of pain, but of a desperate, inconsolable need. The room was empty. There were no adults, just the wounded soldier and the crying child. Elias slumped against the doorframe, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The blood from his leg was now a dark, blossoming stain on the worn floorboards. He felt the cold, hard certainty of his impending death, and for the first time in years he didn't welcome it. The sound of the baby's cry was a sharp, insistent demand that pulled him back from the precipice. It was a call to a life he had forsaken, a responsibility he had buried in 1,000 shallow graves. He saw the baby's face, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he saw the face of his own daughter, the child he had never met, the ghost that haunted his every waking hour. The memory was a lance to his heart, a pain so profound it overshadowed even the bullet in his leg. He had left her. He had chosen the war, the false promise of glory, and in doing so had left behind a life he would never have. And now in this desolate place, he was face to face with the living echo of his greatest sin. He had to crawl to the cradle. He had to do something.
His movement was slow, a deliberate, agonizing descent. He dragged his wounded leg behind him, the rough floorboards a new torment against his skin. The baby's cries intensified, a siren call of desperation. He reached the cradle, his arm trembling with exertion and pain, reaching for the small, wailing form. He lifted the baby, a surprisingly light bundle of warmth and fury, into his arms. The crying stopped almost instantly, replaced by a series of shuddering, broken hiccups. The baby's eyes, a startling shade of blue, locked onto his. It was a look of pure, unadulterated trust, a look that tore through the hardened shell of his soul and found the raw, bleeding core. He had been a killer, a man of violence and destruction. Now he was holding a new life, a fragile, innocent thing that depended on him. He held the child close, the small body a foreign weight against his own broken frame. The warmth of the baby was a shocking comfort, a small, burning coal against the cold emptiness of his chest. He looked around the small room, his mind, dulled by pain and fatigue, starting to process the details. A half-eaten meal on the table, still warm. A woman's shawl draped over a chair. A man's heavy coat hanging on a peg by the door. They were not gone for long, he realized. They had simply stepped out, perhaps to the well, perhaps to tend to a sick animal. They would be back. And when they came back, what would they find? A bloodied, broken soldier holding their child. He imagined the scene, the fear in their eyes, the accusation. He was a harbinger of death, a man who brought the war with him wherever he went. He was not a savior. He was a plague.
His past, a coiled snake, began to uncurl in his mind. The battle, the chaos, the desperate, senseless push against an unseen enemy. The dust and the blood and the sound of men screaming, a symphony of suffering he could never unhear. The memory of a small wooden horse he had carved for his daughter, a gift he had intended to give her when he returned. It sat now on a shelf in a dusty box in his father's house, a testament to a promise he had never kept. He had never returned. He had stayed away, a coward in the face of his own grief. He had been a soldier, a husband, a father, and in the end, he had been none of those things. He had become a vessel for the war, an empty shell filled with the ghosts of the men he had failed to save. The baby stirred in his arms, a small, helpless sound. It was hungry. He could feel the frantic, searching movements of the tiny head against his chest. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on a small, earthenware jug on a shelf. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat next to it. He knew he should leave. He knew his presence here was a threat, a violation. But the baby's cries had started again, a thin, reedy sound that cut through his resolve. He had to feed it. He had to do this one thing, this one act of simple human care, before he finally bled out on the floor. He used his good arm, the one that wasn't a mangled mess of torn flesh and bone, to reach for the jug. It was surprisingly heavy, filled with a creamy, rich-smelling liquid, milk. He found a piece of soft cloth, a frayed dish rag on the table, and soaked it in the milk. He held it to the baby's mouth, and the small, hungry gulps were a sound more profound than any battlefield roar. He sat there, on the floorboards, holding the baby, the world outside a fading memory. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He was no longer a soldier. He was a man, holding a child, trying to keep a fragile flame of life from being extinguished. The blood from his leg had finally stopped its relentless flow, but the pain was a constant, throbbing presence. He felt a deep, profound exhaustion settle over him, the kind that promised no waking. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he let himself drift, not into the past, but into a quiet, still place. When he opened them again, the room was filled with a warm, rosy light. The sun had risen, a new day spilling over the horizon. The baby was sleeping soundly in his arms, a small, peaceful weight. He could hear the sound of horses outside, the distant clatter of a wagon. They were coming back. He felt a moment of cold, unreasoning panic. What would they think? What would he say? He, a man of 100 lies and 1,000 unspoken truths, had no words to offer.
He had only a story written in blood and dust and a sleeping child in his arms. The door creaked open, and a woman stood there, her face a mask of exhaustion and worry. Her eyes, the same startling blue as the baby's, went from his blood-soaked leg to the child in his arms. Her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp. A man, her husband, stood behind her, his face a grim, stony mask. The air was thick with a silence that was heavier than any dialogue, a profound, unanswerable question that hung between them. Who was this man, this ghost of the war, holding their child? Elias, for the first time in years, felt the weight of his own humanity. He was not a monster. He was not a ghost. He was a man, wounded and broken, but capable of a simple act of care. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He simply held the baby out to the woman, a silent offering, a surrender. The woman, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something he couldn't quite decipher, took the child. She held it close, her body trembling. The baby stirred, its small hand reaching out and grasping a lock of her hair. It was a simple, profound gesture of connection, of life. The man, his face softening, stepped forward. He knelt down next to Elias, his gaze falling on the wound. "You're hurt bad, soldier," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "What happened?" The question was simple, but the answer was a story too long and too painful to tell. Elias just shook his head, the effort of speech too great. The man looked at his wife, at the baby now sleeping peacefully in her arms, and a quiet understanding passed between them. He didn't ask again. He simply began to tend to Elias's wound, his hands calloused from years of working the land, surprisingly gentle. As the man cleaned the wound and stitched the torn flesh, Elias looked at the woman, at the child in her arms. The baby was his redemption. It was a tangible, living piece of hope in a world of despair. He had crawled to this farmhouse not to die, but to find a reason to live. He had found it in the cries of a child, in the quiet, simple kindness of strangers. He had been given a second chance, not to be a hero, but to be a man, to honor the memory of the past by living in the present. The sun, now fully risen, was a brilliant golden promise of a new day. The ghosts were still there, he knew, but for the first time in a long time, he felt he might finally be able to outrun them. He was a wounded soldier, but he was no longer alone. He had found a small piece of the world that still held on to hope, and in doing so, he had found a small piece of himself. The past was not a cage. It was a memory. And he, a man who had lost everything, had finally found a home. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.